Hey moms, when we know better, we do better, right? Well, that's our mission. This is Momcast, powered by the Local Moms Network. I'm Demetra Ganias, coming to you from Stanford Studios, and I'm so happy we're in this together. Moms, if you're trying to get pregnant again and it's not working, that can feel really scary. What we need in that moment is information, and no one is giving us more than Dr. Lucky Sekhon. She's a board-certified OB-GYN and fertility specialist, and she has put her entire career's worth of knowledge into one new book, The Lucky Egg. Dr. Lucky joins us today to give us all of her advice and support. Welcome, Dr. Lucky. Let's get one thing straight, Dr. Lucky. The biological clock is real.
Absolutely, it is. It is, and it's something that I think a lot of people are afraid of, and I understand that it's very anxiety-provoking, but I think a lot of the fear comes from not really truly understanding the ins and outs of it and us not normalizing that discussion. So everyone feels like their ovaries are on a timer and that every day counts, but in reality, when you turn 35, you don't fall off a fertility cliff. But it is a biological fact that we should all be aware of as women, that we are born with all the eggs we're ever going to have, and we don't have the capacity to make new eggs or repair our eggs. And so egg quantity, which is important if you should ever decide to freeze your eggs or you need treatments like IVF, and egg quality, which is important even if you're not doing those types of treatments, you're just trying to ovulate a healthy egg each month to try to conceive. Both of those things, both of those parameters decrease as we age, but they're always declining and they're never perfect for anyone, even in our 20s, in our reproductive prime years. But the thing to know is that the changes we see where egg quantity and quality change in a negative direction tend to accelerate as we approach our mid-30s and beyond. So it is an important conversation, and it's an important thing to really understand, especially if you think you may find yourself in a situation where you're trying to build your family, trying to get pregnant beyond 35.
And I think it's such an important point because even if we have children at home, we're talking to moms, right? I had 2 healthy kids at home, was trying for number 3, and boom, infertility hit my family so unexpectedly. I never expected IVF to be part of my journey, but there I was. And I remember thinking to myself, this just doesn't happen. If it happened for us once and then again, totally easily, to be honest, then I just don't want other moms to be surprised because our bodies do change. Our situation does change. Yeah. So talk to us about the numbers. How many people do deal with infertility and then after having a baby actually have secondary infertility?
Yes. So infertility has a variety of causes, but it's unfortunately very common. 1 in 6 individuals or couples will face infertility in their lifetime. And a lot of times we fixate on the female biological clock, but we know half of the cases of infertility involve a male factor, meaning sperm quality issues. And yes, it's true that just because you had an easy time getting pregnant with baby number 1, it doesn't guarantee that it will be easy for baby number 2 or number 3. And of course, a huge part of that is just the amount of time it takes to get pregnant with baby number 1 and then be pregnant for 9 months. No, that's the goal. And then maybe you're breastfeeding, you're not ovulating. Most people, even like myself, couldn't think of trying again for at least another 2 years. It took me for both of my children about 18 months to feel back to normal physically and mentally. And maybe part of that was juggling, being a working mom, who knows? But everyone has their own timeline to feel like they're ready again. And by the time you're ready again to build your family or expand your family with baby number 2 or 3, you might be at an age where things have shifted and the ability to randomly ovulate a healthy egg month after month, that looks different. And it may take many more ovulations for things to randomly line up. And there could be a higher risk of things like miscarriage. But we never speak in absolutes, and not everyone is going to experience that. I am a poster child because I went through that myself. I had my first at 34, and then I ended up really struggling for baby number 2 because I was 37, 38. And for me at that point, things had shifted. But I had actually, because of my job, frozen embryos with my husband at age 34 after I delivered my first, because I had seen so many women fall into that pitfall. And I knew that maybe I wouldn't need to use what I froze, but I wanted to be prepared because it made me anxious. I knew that I had a low egg count. So I knew if I needed to rely on IVF later down the line, it could be more challenging for someone like me. And I'm not suggesting everyone has to freeze eggs or embryos, but I do think having an awareness of the biological clock and being able to plan accordingly can help so many people avoid problems before they start. And another thing I want to point out, because there's so much talk about female age, is that your partner's situation can change too. Just because someone was able to get you or their prior partner pregnant in the past doesn't mean that their sperm quality hasn't shifted. Men are making new sperm every 74 days, a new sperm cell is created. And so even when someone comes to me with a normal analysis, they've had the testing done, but it's been well over a year, I always repeat it because their situation could have changed.
And I think it's interesting that for men, lifestyle choices, we can see great change, right? And you said 72 days. What are the lifestyle changes that you suggest, not just for women, but also for men, but especially for men, because we can see a lot of improvement?
Yes. I always say, it is a target for treatment. And I always talk to both partners if I'm treating a couple and we're going through the testing phase and trying to understand why they haven't gotten pregnant. I talk to both of them about things like diet, exercise, maintaining a healthy weight, not being sedentary. Anything that's better for heart health is going to be better for fertility. The best diet for fertility is often the opposite advice, compared to what you see online. You don't need to necessarily restrict gluten and dairy or be a vegan. You need to have a balanced diet. And really the best diet for heart health, for general health and fertility is a Mediterranean style diet. And it's common sense. It's not sexy advice, right? You want to eat foods that are high in antioxidants, vegetables, fruits. You want to really try to have healthy sources of fiber, and carbs are not your enemy, but you really want to have complex carbs and try to avoid synthesized or processed foods. It all makes sense, right, when you think about it. But I think a lot of the emphasis or onus on making lifestyle changes falls on women because they believe, okay, I need to do whatever I can because I'm the one that's going to eventually carry the pregnancy.
Yeah,
but
we are so much more
is,
stressed than our partners are.
Oh, yeah. And I talk to them all the time about, both of you should be avoiding smoking. Both of you should be limiting alcohol intake. Make it minimal, like less than 4 drinks in a given week, which, let's be honest, especially during the holiday season, easy to exceed, right? And so both partners should be focusing on this. But what's really eye-opening is in recent decades, there has been a growing body of research to show a link between the health of the male partner and their behaviors, their chronic medical conditions, especially if they're uncontrolled, obesity, actually factoring into potential pregnancy complications for their partner. Because the placenta, which is an organ that's temporary and forms during the pregnancy to help nourish a growing fetus, a lot of those genes that determine placental function are coming from the paternal side. And so even problems like high blood pressure in pregnancy, it's very common, preeclampsia in the 3rd trimester. Even morning sickness has been linked to the health of the male partner, and future children's health outcomes have been linked to the health of the male partner at time of conception. So it's really important. It's not about a blame game, but it's about both people who are contributing the egg and the sperm really putting their best foot forward and doing everything they can, because so much of this is out of your control. So the things that you can control, it's going to make you feel better knowing that you're doing all of the right things.
What is the timeline? Talk to us about, these typical things we hear. Try for a year if you're younger than 35 years old. Would you make any changes to that suggestion?
Yeah, I think it's a little too oversimplified. And, I practice in New York City and I'm a pretty type A person. I mean, clearly I was very proactive in my own journey, obviously, based on all of the experiences that I've seen my patients go through. Yes, it's true. It can take up to a year for 85% of couples to conceive with regular unprotected sex timed around ovulation because human reproduction is inefficient. And what you learned in health class, which is you could look at someone of the opposite sex from across the room and maybe get pregnant, isn't necessarily true. Even in your 20s, when you have the best potential egg quality, there's about a 20% chance that the one egg you ovulate that has like a 2 to 3 day window, really, that's high yield for it to get fertilized by sperm, might actually get fertilized, might actually turn into an embryo. Will that embryo actually be healthy even in your 20s? 20 to 25% of embryos might have typos or errors in them that don't allow them to turn into a pregnancy. And so all these things have to line up. I talk about it in my book, The Lucky Egg, and that's actually why I called it that, not because of my name. It's a convenient coincidence, but it really does feel like sometimes pulling the lever of a slot machine. And you have to have persistence to get yourself to a place where your cumulative probability gets to an acceptable level. But you also, like going back to the Vegas analogy, you have to know when to hold them and when to fold them. And so if you're in your 20s, especially even in your early 30s, under the age of 35, it could be permissible. It's not bad advice to say, keep trying for a year, because it's like 20% on 20% on 20%. But eventually, if it hasn't happened in a year, you're falling into an outlier category where there could be something going on. But if someone comes to me under the age of 35 and they're really anxious about this and they're concerned and they want to get a checkup at 6 months, I don't shy away from that. I don't say, oh, just keep trying, because, intuition, there's something to that. And, there could be subtle things that are making them feel more concerned, or maybe they want a large family and they want to get the show on the road. So I don't think it's unreasonable to shorten that window to 6 months. Now, if you're approaching your mid-30s, the guidance is from the American Society of Reproductive Medicine, if you're 35 and older, don't wait longer than 6 months. And I definitely think that that is great advice because of everything we've already talked about, right? Especially if you want to have more than one child, you want to get on the path to pregnancy so that you're not extending your window too long. And really, at 40, it's never too early to have a conversation. If it's been 3 months, you should definitely see a specialist. Now, the caveat is, if you're someone that has a really irregular period, you can't really anticipate or predict when you're going to ovulate. I always say if you're not ovulating or you don't know when you're ovulating, you might not be in the game, right? You have to release an egg. And the best sign that you're not releasing an egg in a regular time fashion is having irregularity in your cycle. Or if your period is really painful, really heavy, any sort of gynecologic red flags that you could have problems like endometriosis or fibroids. These are really common issues that don't necessarily guarantee you're going to have a problem with your fertility, but they are major risk factors. So I think anyone in that situation or with a strong family history of things like early menopause or other fertility issues, go see a specialist early, or at least talk to your OB-GYN because they can order some preliminary tests. And I think not enough women are getting at least one pelvic ultrasound to look at their reproductive organs in their 20s or early 30s. I'm seeing women sometimes in their late 30s, early 40s for the first time. And I'm the first one doing their scan and telling them, oh, you have a septum in your uterus or you have a fibroid. And I don't think that that's right. I think that that's something we really need to work on and figure out a better recommendation to screen women earlier.
Dr. Lucky, I'm so interested in this decision that you made when you had one child to then go ahead and think about your next pregnancy. How do you talk to a patient about whether to freeze their eggs or to go ahead and create embryos and freeze those? Because those are two different avenues. And I know there are even legal issues that come into freezing embryos. Talk to us about that.
Yes. Yeah. And I share my journey openly with my patients because I think it's important to humanize this issue, right? We're all just trying to make the best decisions with the information that we have. And I, at the time, was married. I'd already had one child. So for me, it made sense to freeze embryos because I was already committed and, felt like we were talking very seriously about planning for a second child. So, I had a husband and he was willing to provide the sperm. And once you fertilize an egg with sperm, there's no taking that back. If you're single or you're just not ready to make that commitment, which is irreversible, right? And you're like, I'm doing this to preserve my fertility. Really, the two ways to do that is egg freezing or embryo freezing. And what it's really doing is trying to give yourself a head start if and should you ever need IVF. It's always going to be easier to be successful if you're starting with potentially a larger pool of eggs that you had access to at a younger age because more come to the surface and are available for an egg retrieval procedure. Mm-hmm. But more importantly, a higher proportion of those eggs are able to turn into healthy embryos. So you can freeze them as eggs, which are single cells, and that's just potential. And that leaves you open to all the possibilities. And so even if you're someone who's like, I know I'm going to use sperm donor, but I'm just not ready or willing to make that decision yet, the best we can do is say, let's freeze your eggs. But just like I was saying, human reproduction is inefficient when you're ovulating one egg and hoping for the best. each of those eggs should be viewed as kind of a long shot because you're still confined to working within the inefficient system, even though you did this high-tech process of an egg retrieval. And so you have to bake into the equation that maybe 90% of the eggs will survive the thaw, which is pretty good, but you might lose some in the thaw. 70 to 80% may fertilize, 60% or so will turn into embryos. So it's like this inverted pyramid. And so sometimes it's hard to really know and feel confident about how many do you need. And I give my patients benchmarks, not just based on these numbers, but based on my actual experience with so many of my patients that have come back years later to thaw out their eggs. And what do we typically see? But you can have unexpected outcomes. And I think that's where egg freezing gets a bad rap, right? But it's important to realize it's not yet.
Oh, I was going to ask, can you tell us a little bit about what is the difference between, okay, you have this many that fertilized, and then at 3 days this, and then at 5 days that. What are the different tiers of getting from embryos to actually a potential baby?
Yes. An egg that fertilizes, it has to jump through a lot of hoops to become a day 5 embryo. In your body, what that means is, the egg and sperm get together in your fallopian tube and travel towards the uterus. By the time it's arriving at the uterus, it's about day 4, day 5. And then it maybe develops a little bit more and then it implants. So in the lab, we're trying to emulate what happens naturally when we do IVF. And we let these embryos grow out for about a week after the eggs are retrieved and fertilized. And so going back to your question about embryo freezing, if you have sperm available through a donor or your partner and you feel like this is the person I'm going to have kids with, obviously then up front, we're not freezing the eggs, we're fertilizing them. And so maybe that 10% that would have not survived the thaw, you're getting a few more fertilized, and you're not giving, up on those so early in the game. And then you're seeing a week later how many actually turn into embryos. And I expect maybe like half of what you started with to drop off, if not more. And when you're doing embryos, at least you're going to know in real time. Okay, in a week from the egg retrieval, you're going to get an update of this is how many made it to the embryo stage, but we're not done yet. Once you have an embryo has 100 to 200 cells that cluster together that become a baby, and the cells on the periphery of the embryo that if this embryo implants would one day become the placenta. We can remove some of those outer cells without harming the embryo. And we often do this in like 99% of our IVF cycles where I work. And we send them off for analysis and we can actually freeze the embryos and get a report back about 2 weeks later that will tell us these embryos have all of their DNA that they're supposed to have and have a 60 to 70% chance of implanting. And these ones don't. And they either won't implant or they might result in a problem like a miscarriage in the first trimester. So the point is you're closer to your end goal. You have a better sense of where you stand. It's a little easier to have a handle on, if you have enough, because I always tell patients with a 60 to 70% chance of live birth, aim to have 2 high quality embryos that are genetically normal frozen. And that's why I did what I did. But I always say your ability to come back, your fertility preservation strategy is only as good as your ability to actually come back and use those embryos. And in terms of legality, if you're partnered or you're creating embryos with someone, you both have to sign contracts. If you ever want to come back and use those embryos, you need to have notarized consent forms. No one's able to just make a unilateral decision. And even destroying the embryos and saying, I'm done, with my journey, I don't want to use these. All of this needs to be predetermined who has the rights. What happens if you get divorced? What happens if one partner passes away? I mean, these are really,
it's incredibly complicated.
I know. But it's important to determine this ahead of time.
Dr. Leckie, I'm so curious about why now? Why is now the best time in history to go for a miracle? Because you do that all of the time in your office. That's what you're working toward. I am sure that there's a part of you who likes the competition of saying, okay, you haven't been able to get pregnant somewhere else. Let me take you through my steps and through my strategy. What is so great about the science now that gives you such great opportunity to create families for people?
I love this question. I've never been asked this question that way, but it's actually the thing that makes me tick. It's the thing that gets me up every day and gets me excited and passionate about my job, no matter what aspect of it. I do procedures, I see patients in the office, but here's the thing. I am in a field that has changed at breakneck speed. IVF, which is one of many treatment options, right? It's not the only thing we do, but it is the most high-tech, cutting-edge technology. It was invented in the 70s. And back then, and I have mentors who are still alive who trained me during my fellowship that would tell me about the days before IVF, where all they could really offer patients was, okay, let's do a surgery. Let's try to clean up the pelvic cavity. Let's try to open up the tubes. But there wasn't a way to overcome directly, two tubes that are blocked or a really low sperm count. And the success, once it was invented for the first decade or so, I mean, you'd be lucky if your patient got pregnant, right? You'd say, oh my gosh, there's a 5% chance. Do you want to sign up for this experimental treatment? And we don't really know, how to do this well yet. So we're going to try to, give it our best shot. And what that meant was there was a lot of imprecision. You take whatever eggs you could out of the ovaries and you would grow them in the lab, and you wouldn't grow them out that far because nobody knew how to do that. So you wouldn't be able to really tell which ones are good and which ones are not. And you'd have to put back multiple because we didn't even know how to freeze them. So it was like, you don't put someone through this whole process of the shots and the procedure and then just only put in 1 or 2 embryos. You might put in 5 or 6. And it was crazy back then. People were having triplets, quadruplets. People were getting something called hyperstimulation syndrome. It was commonplace for these types of complications and high-risk pregnancies. Fast forward to today. We now know how to grow the embryos out further so we can weed out the ones that don't even have reproductive potential. We can genetically test them. We can freeze them with a 97 to 98% thaw survival rate. So I can count on one hand the number of times I have transferred more than 1 embryo. Because if you have a genetically tested high quality embryo, all you're doing by putting back 2 or more is really putting a person at an increased risk of twins with 6 times higher rate of preterm labor. I hardly ever have patients with hyperstimulation syndrome because nowadays we're freezing all the embryos, letting the hormone levels cool down and go back to normal baseline. And then in the subsequent cycle, we're getting people pregnant. So we're getting people pregnant at higher rates with lower risks of complications, and it's more comfortable for them. And we're able to freeze. So even those who aren't ready or aren't partnered have an ability to give themselves the best chance for the future. And I find that so empowering as a woman who started her family building journey in her 30s, as someone who did eventually end up relying on using what I froze, and as someone who really believes that this has allowed me to feel like I do have it all. And now I don't necessarily think that's something everyone should feel is necessary, because that's sometimes that trope of women trying to have it all can make us feel really overwhelmed, and it can make us feel bad about our lives and our choices. But I always say, as a fertility doctor that has helped so many people freeze, right? Maybe you can have it all, but maybe you have to be strategic about it. And maybe you can have different things at different times. And our biology doesn't wait for anyone. And so having this type of technology is so important for so many.
You hit on something that I think is so important, and that is the ability to control and have some kind of timeline over our lives.
Yeah. I mean, I feel so privileged to be part of these very intimate, vulnerable conversations. I feel an immediate connection when a patient walks through my door. We get right to it. I spend a full hour with every single patient that I meet. And, I look at everything before they walk in. So I already kind of know from the information they've provided what the situation is. And then I don't write notes while I'm talking to them. I'm actually locked in and I'm listening to their story. And I feel so privileged to be in that situation, receiving that information. And then I'm using my expertise and all the knowledge that I have, which can probably feel so overwhelming to the person that's been reading blogs or looking up things online. Maybe they have scraps of this information, but it just feels like too much. And my job is, as a communicator, to take that knowledge and synthesize it. I feel like a human chat GPT. I'm like, okay, how do I now put it into ways that they can understand, that's accessible, not cold and clinical, but makes, it's relayed in a way that puts it in context and gives them a framework then to make an informed decision. All too often, I've had patients come to me sometimes for second opinions where they say, I had a consult. And then I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to pretend you didn't. And I'm going to go through all of this information with you. And they're like, oh my God, like this is so illuminating. I didn't know. And I'm not saying that there are good doctors, there are bad doctors, there are doctors that just don't have enough time or maybe don't understand the importance of that initial visit and the amount of education you provide up front. And that's why I wrote my book, because I don't think our system is set up in a way where people are coming in with the knowledge base they ideally should have to be able to make the right decisions for themselves. And when you're dealing with something really time sensitive, it's so important to have the right information as early as possible. And so what I hope people view this as is like a fertility Bible that brings them up to speed. Everything I've ever done outside of patient care, whether it be a social media post, a blog post, it's always, what need do I need to fill? And the biggest need I think we need to fill as a society is the knowledge gap when it comes to all things fertility. It sounds very dramatic, but we're talking about the perpetuation of the human race. And there have been so many headlines about lower live birth rates and, the waning populations and having like a population that's lopsided. And, there's a lot of reasons for that. Not everyone has to have children. But I think if people do want to have children, we have to meet them where they're at and recognize that society has shifted. The age at which we're starting to try, or we feel financially independent and have the wherewithal to try, has shifted, but our biology has not evolved, and we have to find solutions for that.
Your book is a comprehensive guide on science, but I'm so curious about mental health because you say you didn't intend to write this much about mental health, but here you are.
Yeah. Well, because I think I've learned so much from helping my patients, on their journey longitudinally, which often is not a sprint. It can feel like a marathon. And I see the common thread between the people that are able to stick with it and be persistent and get to the finish line. And even sometimes I view myself as a pretty resilient person. I'm like a hard worker, I'm like that type A person. But even I sometimes I'm like, how are you doing this? Some patients go through so much and yet they keep showing up day after day after day. But I find the common thread is the people that are able to do that and really withstand it, and also still seem to have their relationship intact, still seem to, have their sense of self. Like you don't see like the light in their eye dimming. It's because they're still prioritizing themselves. They're still, practicing self-care. They're still taking a break between cycles and going on a little vacation. Like there is so much that is required of you. But if you treat this like other life achievements, like you're cramming for a board exam or, you might burn out. And I think it's easy to under anticipate how difficult this journey can be mentally. And my own experience is what really led me to make mental health such a huge emphasis in my book. It's not just like a little chapter. Every chapter, whether we're talking about low egg count or someone who is dealing with multiple miscarriages, those are different types of emotional challenges and they need to be met differently. And so there's discussions about mental health throughout, because I truly believe that we need to be doing like 50-50 as fertility doctors and clinics. We need to not just be focusing on the physical medicine, but also the mental health aspect, because that's how we're going to help our patients be successful and to preserve their quality of life. And when I was going through my own journey, it wasn't as straightforward as maybe I've relayed in this conversation. But I don't want to make it about me, but I did have a canceled cycle. I did have a cycle where I only got 2 eggs and nothing turned into embryos. And I went into it super cocky because I'm an expert. I did my treatments at my clinic with someone that I know very well and trust, and still a great friend of mine and colleague. I had every reason to think I'd be totally breezing through this thing. And even when the response looked low, I was like, it's okay. I know why. I can intellectualize why. But then I, behind closed doors, would break down and cry in my office and feel like guilty and say to myself things that I'm always telling patients aren't true. Like, it's not your fault. But I'd say, oh my God, it's my fault. I should have really cleared my schedule more. I should have slept more. Like all these irrational thoughts. So if
we play the blame game for sure.
Right. And if I felt blindsided by the emotional impact, how does a layperson who doesn't have my experience go through this? And that's why mental health has become a huge part of everything I talk about with patients and a huge part of my book.
Something that I grappled with during my IVF journey was, God, am I being selfish? I have 2 healthy kids at home. My family would be perfectly fine as this wonderful 4. Why am I doing this? And I really had to put aside those feelings of I'm being selfish, I'm wanting too much, I'm praying for too much, I'm asking for too many things, I'm asking for too much from my life. I'm allowed to want what I want, and it was hard to get there.
Absolutely.
How do you speak to your patients who are grappling with those same feelings?
Yeah, no, I totally get it. I always say infertility is the worst club to be a part of with the best members, right? And that's a saying a lot of people say because there's such a great community, even if it's not in person, online, there's a lot more people talking about it than they were 10 to 20 years ago.
Yeah.
I don't know how our moms and grandmothers went through it without the technology and the access to care and the support from the community. That didn't exist. But I do think that there is a blind spot and we're doing less of a good job at supporting women with secondary infertility. I think they themselves have this guilt. I had it. This is why I never talked about it. You know, a lot of fertility doctors on social, they're open about their journey. It took me many years until I was already out of it to now look back and say, okay, this is what I was going through. Because in the moment, it felt very tone deaf to me. I'm just being honest. I felt like, well, you know, I had patients that would just be so grateful and thankful to have one. And I already have this beautiful baby girl. And I can't complain about this to anyone. I can't talk about this. I mean, it's going to be viewed as like a champagne problem. And I think a lot of women with secondary infertility feel that way.
Yes.
But something I always tell my patients is you're allowed to want what you want, and everyone is entitled to what they visualize for themselves in their future. And they know in their heart what's important to them. And that doesn't make their journey or their struggles any less valid. I have this conversation with people all the time. You're on your own path. And I think comparison is the thief of joy. And I don't think anyone should ever let that be a reason that they don't seek out support or share their journey, because I did. And now looking back, I'm like, that was silly. Like, I do think that we need to be a bit more mindful. They assume if you already have one child, you don't have infertility. What do they know, right? And so they're like, oh, time's ticking. When are you going to give them a little baby brother or baby sister? People still ask me, you know, when are you going to give your two girls a baby brother? And
oh my
I
God.
would be lying if I said it didn't sting. I mean, I have embryos frozen, but like my husband doesn't want to go through that path again. And I did for a long time. And again, I didn't talk about it in the moment, but now years out, once we've come to the resolution and I'm like, I'm done, I can now talk about it. And I think for a lot of people that there might be some sort of, you know, defense mechanism there. So I always admire people that can talk about their journey in real time. I'm personally not one of those people. I need to process internally. But that's also something too, right? Like partners aren't always necessarily going to be on the same page. And you have to go through a period of grief and mourning about like, okay, this is something I wanted for myself. Sometimes it's your biology. You know, there's been women who have gone through medical issues where they're like, maybe it's not safe for me to go forward, even though I want to, and I'm happy with what I've got. And so everyone's on their own journey. There's no right or wrong. And that's really an important message that I tell my patients, because this guilt has to go away.
Is there a moment in the IVF journey that you say, Dr. Lucky, this is the end now? This is the situation that tells me we need to move on. And that doesn't mean you're not going to be a parent. Yes, you can adopt. Yes, maybe you want to use a donor egg or donor sperm. But is there a situation or a series of facts in front of you in which you say, this is it now?
Yes. And there's no black and white answer. I get asked this all the time. Like, how do you know it's time to move on to donor egg? Or if someone's having difficulty with implantation of an embryo, how do you know it's time for thinking about other options like surrogacy? There is no one size fits all answer. I mean, a huge portion of this is, when is a patient ready to explore other options? Are they open to other options? Not everyone is, and that is totally okay.
True, yeah.
But I think when it comes to, there's two types of problems that I've just kind of outlined. I think when it comes to someone trying to, and I'm going to focus on IVF, even though obviously there are other treatments like medicated IUI or people just trying on their own. But when I think of the ladder of aggressiveness, like IVF is the most effective treatment, and there isn't something beyond that. There's elements that we can insert like donor egg or gestational care or surrogacy. So that's what I'm really focused on. So if someone's going through retrieval cycles or trying to get eggs out and turn them into embryos, if they have such a low egg count, they maybe don't even ovulate on their own, or their ovaries are kind of fluctuating in their function. If I can't get anything to grow and I can't get you to the egg retrieval, maybe I stop the meds and we try a different protocol. Maybe we try it 2 or 3 different ways. But if I've exhausted every option and I can't get to the egg retrieval, that is like an early indicator that we need to work around this problem and we need to start talking about alternatives. A lot of people will get to the retrieval, but maybe have a hard time turning the eggs into embryos, or maybe they have a hard time getting eggs to be mature. I have a whole section in my book that, and I don't think this exists anywhere, I've looked, written by a fertility doctor, where it's like troubleshooting. And I talk about the different problems. I even put quotes like, I can't get to retrieval. I can't respond. Okay. What are the different protocols that I think, based on science, are the best at getting people with low ovarian reserve to respond? What are the ways to pre-treat someone to get them to respond? Low fertilization or no fertilized eggs. Okay. Well, what are things you can do? Experimental and proven. Okay. That's a different set of problems, but maybe that's the roadblock you're hitting. A lot of people, they're able to get past that roadblock, but they may have trouble getting those fertilized eggs to turn into embryos. There are things that you can look into, things that you can try differently, even on the egg and the sperm side. There are things that are external factors like optimizing your health and treating insulin resistance, or sorting the sperm differently. If you're getting embryos, but they're always abnormal, what does that mean? So it really depends on where you're hitting a snag. And if, despite trying those different things, you continually hit that snag. But also, let's address the elephant in the room. It's also about access and what's feasible. And we don't all have an endless, supply of coverage for doing, 50 egg retrievals.
I know it's a complicated question, but have there been advances in how much insurance is covering of IVF or other treatments?
Absolutely. Oh my gosh. That's another amazing thing that I wake up every day and feel excited and encouraged about. 10 years ago, 0% of egg freezing cycles were covered by insurance. It was viewed as purely elective, like cosmetic surgery. Now, over 50% of the cycles of my patients that are doing egg freezing, and obviously it's a selected population, are covered by insurance. A lot of that is coming from the private sector, from workplace benefits. And definitely there's more of that in places like New York, where it's a competitive marketplace for jobs. But, the point is that there's no one size fits all answer. And I think it's a really personalized decision. And I think it's also going to be about what makes sense for you and how to use your resources, right? You don't want to keep doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different outcome and exhaust yourself financially, where now even the other options aren't an option. And that's difficult, because I always want it to be about the medicine and not about finances, but that's the reality. And everyone has a different situation financially and insurance wise. So it's important to go to a clinic that's not just good with the medicine and up to date with things in a way that lowers your risk of complications and is providing you with the best chance of success, and also supports your mental health, and you feel like you can get the information you need and be supported through your journey. But also, a huge part of my team is like the financial counselors, right? Because they're giving people upfront information that helps them to be strategic with their resources. So it's one of those things where, starting a clinic, it's very complicated. And to do a good job, you really have to have a multidisciplinary approach.
I can picture women, moms who might even have kids at home, buying this book and sort of, whether they share it with their partners or just keeping it for themselves for the sake of information. What a service you're providing by putting everything you know and all of your experience into one place. What was the ultimate goal you have for this book?
My goal is that it is like the fertility Bible. I hope girls in their early 20s are like, I need to get this because this is essential reading. I have 2 ovaries.
I couldn't agree more.
Need to understand. Yes. And I hope that also the person who's actively trying, and maybe their family knows that they're going through fertility treatment, if they're running into roadblocks, I hope that they say, you know what, I don't want to put the onus of me having to educate you and loop you into everything that's going on with us. Read this book. I think there's, so much valuable information that can help educate society as a whole, even if you're not falling into the 1 in 6 couples or people that face infertility, or the 1 in 4 that face pregnancy losses. Everyone should be more educated about this, because then we learn more, create awareness, understand the need for better access to care, and we're better able to mentally support our friends, our family members, our coworkers. We will develop better policies that make it easier to go through fertility treatments, because so many people go through fertility treatments. And if you're listening to this and you think you don't know a single person, they just haven't told you about it. I guarantee it.
Exactly. It is so much more common than we know. Well, thank you, Dr. Lucky. I'm so grateful for your honesty, not only your medical opinions, but I always say the greatest gift that a mother can give is her vulnerability. So thank you for sharing your story and for writing this fertility Bible.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate this conversation, and I hope it helps a lot of people.
Moms, we're so grateful you're part of our community. Don't forget to rate and review Momcast to help us spread the word, and follow us on Instagram at the Local Moms Network. I'm Demetra Ganias. We'll find you back here next week from Stanford Studios.